2:18 on November 19, 2024. Deep inside Russia's Bryansk region, night vision feeds flicker as a logistics site goes from routine to ruin in seconds. A first blast snaps the dark, then a second, sharper one rolls through like a cough turning into convulsions. Classic secondary detonations, the kind that turn a storage point into a chain reaction. Somewhere in Ukraine, a small team listens to radio silence and watches the clock, knowing this isn't just about one strike. It's about choking the bloodstream of an army. But what happens when you squeeze a logistics artery too hard? The Bryansk region sits well behind the front lines, but in modern war behind no longer means safe. Since early 2024, Russia has leaned heavily on a lattice of railheads, depots, and road junctions stretching from its western regions into occupied Ukrainian territory. Bryansk is one of those quiet workhorses, not a glamorous base, not a frontline city, but a node where ammunition, fuel, and spare parts briefly pause before flowing south and west. In a war measured in artillery rounds per day, that pause matters. For Ukraine, the logic is brutally simple. You don't need to destroy an entire army if you can slow its pulse. Russian firepower depends on volume. Thousands of shells move daily by rail, then broken down into truck convoys. Hit the guns and you trade shot for shot. Hit the logistics, and the guns fall silent on their own. That's why throughout 2024, Ukrainian planners increasingly framed the battlefield as a system rather than a line. Depots, bridges, rail switches, and warehouses became as valuable as tanks. For Russia, protecting these hubs is a strategic headache. Frontline air defense is layered and dense. Rear area defense is spread thin across vast distances. A logistics site like Bryansk must be guarded without advertising its importance, hardened without halting throughput, and defended without pulling scarce systems away from the front. Every additional launcher or radar assigned to the rear is one less covering troops under fire. The political stakes compound the military ones. Strikes deep into Russian territory blur long-standing red lines and invite escalation narratives. Moscow frames them as provocations enabled by Western technology. Kyiv frames them as legitimate attacks on military infrastructure feeding an invasion. Both narratives matter because they shape what comes next, what weapons are authorized, what targets are deemed acceptable, and how far each side believes the other is willing to go. By mid-November 2024, this tension had reached a point of compression. Ukraine had the means to reach farther than before. Russia had signaled that certain thresholds would trigger a response. Bryansk, quiet and utilitarian, sat right at that intersection, important enough to hurt, distant enough to send a message. The strike would not just test defenses, it would test assumptions about how much pressure a logistics artery can take before the entire system reacts. Before the first explosion lit up the Bryansk night, the operation had already been unfolding for weeks, quietly, methodically, and without spectacle. Modern strikes on rear area logistics don't begin with launchers, they begin with data, patterns, absences. Small, almost boring details that only become lethal when assembled into a whole. From Ukraine's side, the picture was built layer by layer. Commercial satellite imagery, updated daily, revealed subtle rhythms. Rail cars arriving at the same siding every 48 hours, trucks queuing longer on certain nights, temporary storage areas expanding and contracting under camouflage netting. None of this screamed high-value target on its own. Together, it suggested a hub under pressure, moving large volumes quickly and therefore vulnerable if disrupted at the wrong moment. Signals intelligence filled in the gaps. Increases in encrypted radio traffic around specific time windows hinted at scheduled transfers. Open-source data rail schedules, fuel delivery contracts, even weather reports helped narrow down when operations would peak. The goal was not just to hit the site, but to hit it when the consequences would cascade, when stocks were concentrated, when replacement routes were least ready, when disruption would echo forward for days. Inside Ukraine, a small planning cell worked through the implications. A deeper strike meant more than accuracy, it meant timing. Miss by minutes and you burn empty sheds. Hit on cue and you trigger secondary detonations, the unmistakable sign that logistics, not just structures, have been struck. The planners knew what that would look like on infrared feeds, one bloom then another, then the telltale rolling flashes that no fire alone can explain. On the Russian side, there were precautions but also constraints. Rear area defenses rely on warning time. Unlike the front, where radar coverage is continuous in dense regions like Bryansk, depend on a patchwork of sensors and patrols. Camouflage reduces visibility from above, but it doesn't erase heat signatures or traffic patterns. Dispersal lowers risk, but slows throughput. Every defensive measure trades efficiency for security, and logistics systems are built for efficiency first. As November 19th approached, both sides sensed pressure building even if neither could see the full picture. Ukrainian teams waited for confirmation that the hub was full. Russian operators followed routine, trusting that distance still provided a margin of safety. In modern war, that margin is thin and often invisible until it collapses. 0218 turns into motion. From Ukraine's perspective, the moment is almost anticlimactic. There is no roar, no visible launch, just a sequence of confirmations ticking off on a checklist. Coordinates locked, timing window open, final authorization passed down a narrow chain. Somewhere far from Bryansk, a launch crew executes a routine they have rehearsed dozens of times, knowing that routine is what keeps mistakes from becoming headlines. Minutes later, the logic of the strike arrives before the sound does. Russian sensors pick up anomalies fast, high-energy objects entering coverage from unexpected vectors. Rear area air defenses are designed to catch drones and aircraft, not necessarily to react instantly to precision munitions arriving at the edge of their envelope. Alarms trigger, procedures start. But procedures consume time, and time is the one resource a logistics hub cannot afford to lose. The first detonation is sharp and contained, punching into a storage zone near the heart of the site. On its own, it would be serious but manageable. Then the second blast follows, heavier, deeper. This one doesn't just destroy, it ignites. Ammunition cooks off unevenly, producing the irregular rhythm that experienced analysts recognize immediately. Secondary detonations, not a single strike, but a chain reaction. From nearby roads, drivers abandon vehicles. From control rooms, operators watch feeds dissolve into static as power drops. Fire suppression systems activate, but they are built for accidents, not for a depot turning into its own weapon. Each explosion sends pressure waves through adjacent stacks, loosening casings, cracking seals, setting conditions for the next flash. The hub is no longer a node, it is a liability. Russian response is swift but reactive. Air defenses scan for follow-on threats. Units are ordered to disperse what remains intact. Rail traffic is halted as a precaution, freezing movement across multiple lines feeding the region. What matters now is not what was destroyed, but what cannot move. Every hour the hub is offline forces improvisation downstream, longer routes, smaller convoys, tighter schedules. For Ukraine, confirmation comes indirectly. Satellite imagery shows heat plumes expanding, then lingering far longer than a structural fire would justify. Social media videos geolocated within hours capture distant flashes and muffled booms. Analysts don't need exact numbers. Secondary detonations mean one thing: stocks were present, and they were hit at the worst possible moment. The pressure on Russian logistics is immediate, but the strategic pressure is just beginning. Because when a rear area hub burns, the question is never only how much was lost, it's what message was sent and how will it be answered. The defensive response unfolds in layers, each revealing a different kind of strain. Within minutes, regional air defense units shift posture. Radars sweep wider arcs, looking for follow-on strikes that never come. Fighters are placed on higher readiness, not because an aircraft is inbound, but because uncertainty is now the threat. Rear area defenses are designed to reassure, yet after a logistics hub ignites, reassurance is hard to manufacture. Every unexplained radar return becomes suspect. Every delay feels dangerous. On the ground, the more urgent problem is containment. Firefighting teams move cautiously, aware that unexploded ordnance may still be cooking off. Commanders face an uncomfortable choice: push crews in to save what remains or pull back and accept further losses to avoid casualties. In logistics, time saved equals capability preserved, but only if people survive to use it. As the night stretches on, sections of the site are written off entirely. The ripple effects spread fast. Rail traffic feeding the hub is halted as a precaution, creating a bottleneck that reaches far beyond Bryansk. Trains are rerouted, some delayed for hours, others for days. Truck convoys that expected to load and move are told to wait or divert, adding kilometers and fuel costs to every run. What looked like a single strike begins to tax an entire distribution network. Operationally, Russian units closer to the front feel the impact first. Ammunition deliveries arrive late or in smaller batches. Resupply schedules tighten. Commanders adjust fire plans, not dramatically but enough to be noticed. Fewer rounds allocated per day. Less margin for error. Logistics rarely collapses all at once. It erodes quietly in ways that only become obvious after repeated disruption. Strategically, the strike forces Moscow into a defensive recalculation. Protecting every rear area hub with dense air defense is impossible. Dispersal reduces risk, but slows tempo. Hardened storage helps against accidents, not precision strikes. Each option carries costs, and those costs accumulate with every successful hit. The question is no longer whether logistics can be pressured, but how much pressure can be tolerated before a response is deemed necessary. And that is where the significance of Bryansk truly emerges. Because while fires are still burning and trains sit idle, attention shifts upward to decision-makers weighing deterrence, escalation, and signaling. A logistics artery has been squeezed. The system has reacted. Now the world waits to see how far that reaction will go. To understand why the Bryansk strike resonated so far beyond the smoke and debris, it helps to step back from the explosions and look at the mechanics behind them briefly and without losing sight of the story. From Ukraine's perspective, the tool that made this kind of pressure possible is reach. Systems like ATACMS extend the battlefield hundreds of kilometers beyond the front line, turning what were once safe rear areas into contested space. The key is not just range, but precision. A single accurate strike against a logistics hub can achieve what dozens of frontline engagements cannot. It forces the opponent to spend time, resources, and attention away from the fight they actually want to wage. For Russia, the defensive dilemma is structural. Air defense systems are optimized to protect cities' command nodes and frontline formations. Rear area coverage relies on early warning and depth, not density. Even when intercepts occur, they impose costs. Missiles expended, crews fatigued, and systems repositioned. Over time, defending everything becomes as unsustainable as replacing everything. This is where the strike transitions from a tactical success into a strategic signal. It demonstrates not only capability, but intent, the willingness to apply sustained pressure on the infrastructure that keeps an army moving. And in deterrence theory, intent matters as much as hardware. A single strike can be absorbed. A pattern forces choices. Those choices in Moscow quickly took on a broader meaning. If logistics hubs are no longer sanctuaries, then distance no longer guarantees safety. If Western-supplied systems enable this reach, then responses may need to speak not just to the battlefield, but to the geopolitical audience watching it. 2 days later, that logic surfaced in dramatic form. Russia unveiled and employed a weapon it had not previously used in combat, a new missile system framed explicitly as a message. The timing was no accident. Bryansk had applied pressure to the arteries of war. What followed was an attempt to apply pressure to perception itself. November 21st, 2024. 2 days after Bryansk, the message changes tone. In the early hours, a missile strikes the city of Dnipro. Russian officials move quickly to frame it not as a routine attack, but as something different, a demonstration. The weapon is named Oreshnik, presented as a new system, faster, harder to intercept, and symbolically tied to escalation rather than attrition. In contrast to the quiet efficiency of a logistics strike, this is loud by design. From a technical standpoint, the details released are selective. Speed is emphasized. Reach is implied. Survivability is suggested through ambiguity. What matters is not what Oreshnik definitively is, but what it is meant to signal: that Russia retains options to raise the stakes when pressure reaches sensitive nodes. This is deterrence through announcement, as much as through impact. Strategically, the contrast with Bryansk is stark. Ukraine's strike targeted function, how ammunition moves, how tempo is sustained. Russia's response targets perception, how far escalation might go, how uncertain the next step could be. One attack slows an army. The other aims to unsettle decision-making. For planners on both sides, the lesson is uncomfortable. Pressure on logistics works, but it rarely goes unanswered. Each successful disruption forces a counter-narrative, a counter-capability, or a counter-threat. The battlefield becomes not just a contest of weapons, but of thresholds: how much damage is tolerable, how much signaling is enough, and when signaling turns into commitment. For observers, Oreshnik underscores a deeper shift. Modern conflict is no longer linear. A strike on a warehouse can echo into strategic messaging within days. Tactical actions compress decision timelines at the highest levels. In that environment, escalation doesn't always climb step by step. It jumps, driven by the need to restore deterrence credibility as much as battlefield advantage. The Bryansk strike pressured an artery. Oreshnik was meant to remind everyone that the heart can still strike back. Whether that reminder stabilizes the conflict or pushes it into a more dangerous phase depends on what comes next and how each side interprets the signals already sent. The immediate impact of these two events, Bryansk and then Dnipro, is not measured only in burned ammunition or cratered concrete. It is measured in adjustments. Quiet ones, costly ones. On the ground, Russian logistics adapts the way large systems always do by fragmenting. Stockpiles are broken into smaller lots. Routes multiply. Convoys run less predictably, often at night, often with longer gaps. This reduces the risk of catastrophic loss, but it also slows everything. More drivers, more fuel, more coordination. Each layer added for protection becomes friction. Over weeks, that friction translates into fewer shells at the front, tighter rationing, and less flexibility for commanders who once relied on volume to compensate for uncertainty. Ukraine, meanwhile, absorbs a different lesson. Striking logistics delivers leverage, but it also accelerates escalation cycles. Every deep strike sharpens the debate over thresholds, what is allowed, what is tolerated, and what triggers a response meant for audiences far beyond the battlefield. The calculus becomes as political as it is military. Pressure must be applied carefully, rhythmically, without handing the opponent a pretext they can exploit more effectively than the damage inflicted. For the wider international audience, the sequence offers a preview of how modern wars may increasingly unfold. Precision weapons do not just destroy, they communicate. Logistics hubs become pressure points not because they are glamorous, but because they sit at the intersection of efficiency and vulnerability. Missiles like Oreshnik, whether revolutionary or incremental, become symbols in a narrative contest over resolve and restraint. The central lesson is this: wars are no longer decided only where soldiers meet. They are shaped where supplies pause, where decisions hesitate, and where signals are interpreted under stress. Bryansk showed how fragile the arteries of war can be. Oreshnik showed how quickly the response can move from infrastructure to intimidation. As technology extends reach and compresses reaction time, the space for miscalculation grows thinner. Each strike, each announcement, each demonstration carries weight far beyond its immediate effect. Understanding that chain pressure response perception is essential not just for analysts and planners, but for anyone trying to grasp where this conflict is heading. For now, the smoke has cleared in Bryansk and the message has been delivered in Dnipro. The question that remains is not what happened, but how the next signal will be read. What ties Bryansk and Dnipro together is not geography, but logic. One strike squeezed the machinery of war, the other sought to reshape the psychology around it. Together, they reveal a conflict increasingly defined by systems thinking where pressure is applied not only to forces in the field, but to the networks, assumptions, and perceptions that sustain them. The attack on the logistics hub demonstrated how vulnerable modern armies remain when efficiency becomes a liability. Concentration saves time and fuel until a single hit turns that concentration into a multiplier of loss. The response with Oreshnik, by contrast, illustrated a different imperative when functional pressure mounts, signaling escalates. Speed, novelty, and ambiguity become tools intended to restore deterrence, even if their practical battlefield effect is limited. For military planners, the takeaway is sobering. Rear areas are no longer rear. Logistics is no longer a background function. Every node is a potential battlefield, and every successful disruption invites a reply that may not mirror the original action but leap to a higher rung of the escalation ladder. Managing that ladder, deciding when to climb, when to pause, and when to step back has become as critical as any tactical decision. For the international community, the sequence underscores how quickly localized events can ripple outward. A strike on a depot can influence weapons policy debates. A missile demonstration can recalibrate threat perceptions far beyond its target. In this environment, restraint and clarity matter as much as capability. Ambiguous signals may deter, or they may invite misreading at the worst possible moment. Bryansk pressured an artery. Oreshnik pressed on nerves. Neither act on its own decides the war, but together they map the terrain of modern conflict, interconnected, accelerated, and unforgiving of error. As technology continues to extend reach and compress time, the margin for misunderstanding shrinks and the cost of getting signals wrong rises. Understanding these dynamics is not about choosing sides. It is about recognizing how wars now function, how they escalate, and how they might one day be contained. That understanding is the first step toward anticipating what comes next. Bye for now.